G'day guys and welcome back to Captain's Corner for round 3, 2025. Here I'm joined by Rossco, my fellow co-host from the Third Man Up, as well as part of the SuperCoach Swordplay family, as well as SuperCoach with DR. Today we're going to discuss the key captaincy options for round 3. Before we jump into the round 3 captaincy options, we're just going to give a quick recap about our round 2 results. So it's probably the epitome of a mixed bag. So in terms of our VCs, Roscoe, you had TDK, Merritt, Richards as your 1, 2, 3 for your VCs. All scored a ton. Merritt the highlight there with the 145. I personally had TDK, Nick Dacos, and Rankin. Dacos was the highlight, 125, but what could have been with Isaac Rankin there, as well as TDK, both of them starting out quite hot. So, look, I don't think anything sort of went wrong in terms of our process. Just the outcome there was a bit not quite what we desired. In terms of the captaincy options, too, we both nailed both Neil and Dunkley. Neil, especially with the 133, a great shot there. Unfortunately, the North Melbourne game didn't go to plan. And Harry Sheasel for you and Christian Petrarch for me just didn't pan out. But look, I think in all, there were 25 players last week that went above 120, which is the VCC threshold normally. And off those 25 players, 10 of them were owned by more than 5% of players. So the ones that if you had some of these players and you got onto them, you would have got a good captaincy score out of was Jack McRae, Jack Sinclair, Zach Merritt, Tristan Cherry, Dane Zorko, Lockie Neal, Connor Rosie, Clayton Oliver, Nick Dacos, Jordan Dawson, and Jordan Clark. So if you put your VC or C on them, well done. You did quite well. Now let's crack into the top options for round 3. When we look across these sort of top options, we can sense there are a couple of matchups which we are looking to target. And this is the top options which we've sort of taken up for this video. All of the options will be found in the Captain's Corner post on the Third Man Up X page tomorrow or on Wednesday. In terms of the top matchups to target, Ross, what are you sort of looking at this week, specifically from a matchup perspective?
Yeah, look, I think there's 3, and these will be very heavily reflected across our VC and C picks. The first one, very early Thursday night, I'm looking at Port Adelaide versus Essendon. Essendon put up a bit of a putrid performance against Adelaide at the MCG. Many thought they'd perform a bit better. They get back to Marvel, which will help, but Port Adelaide have looked decent and obviously destroyed Richmond last weekend. So they're coming in running pretty hot after they got destroyed themselves by Collingwood in round 1. So I think a couple of their players, particularly Connor Rosie, definitely one to look out for as a VC option. The other matchup I'm looking forward to from a Supercoach perspective and hopefully a footy perspective is St Kilda taking on Richmond. I've got my eyes all over players like McRae, Marshall, Sinclair, even Nankervis. I think he can go all right against Rowan Marshall. I don't have him in my options, but I can see it being a fairly friendly Supercoach game. The last one for me is Brisbane Lions playing against Geelong. Wet weather footy, which is, suspected to be on the forecast. But if you can nail the right pick, I think there's definitely some scope for Brisbane to score really well against Geelong as well. What about you?
Yeah, look, I think you've nailed 3 of the matchups I was thinking of. The other one I'm thinking about is West Coast. Fremantle against West Coast. We're thinking about our Caleb Sarongs. Finally is a time that he can get away from a tag. He's, not necessarily tagged against Geelong. Was sort of nullified a little bit and played a little bit up forward. Then tagged hard by James Jordan on the weekend. Can he finally break loose like we saw Lockie Neal do against West Coast on the weekend? Andy Brayshaw as well, and also Jordan Clark. So I think all 3 of them are fine options. So now that we've talked about matchup, I think there's a couple of intangible factors that I want to bring into this. And one of the key tips which I provided in the season guide was focusing on the role of captains that have a lot of pride in their teams and how they bounce back after poor losses. So last week we saw Essendon, poor loss, get put basically through the whole ring in the media. But I think even more than that, the public outing of Max Gawn going through tough circumstances, the poor performance, then Simon Goodwin, you wouldn't say calling him out in the media, but basically bringing it to the attention. I think both Zach Merritt and Max Gawn are in for big games. And yes, Max Gawn playing Gold Coast, Jared Witt's not the best matchup, but I don't think there is more to say about Max as a character than it wouldn't surprise me if he comes out and puts out a 150 on the MCG this week. That's basically where I'm going with that one. And same with Zach Merritt there as well. In terms of the other intangible factors that we can't really quantify right now is the effect of the taggers. Taggers are back in vogue, as we know. And when we cast our eye through the matchups, I just mentioned that Zach Merritt is a really good captaincy option due to the potential for him to bounce back. Not him bounce back, but the team. He kicked 30 and 4. Does that attract the opposition of attention off of Willem Drew against Port Adelaide? Then, as we go down the matchups, does Camden McIntosh tag at all? Because yes, Jack McRae is an accumulator, but is he really the Patrick Cripps type to get tagged? And then I don't really think that he tagged on the weekend. He just was at centre bounces. The big one to watch, and for Will Day owners, is even one of the reasons why you may consider trading him out, is that he's probably likely to attract the Toby Bedford tag. For once, we can breathe a sigh of relief because James Jordan can safely not tag someone this week. We can be pretty sure of that. But following on from that, Ross, is there any sort of data or stats that point to like whether you're considering the player's form, the average against an opponent, or an average at venue that should be brought to people's attentions?
Look, I do really enjoy seeing the average at venue. I think players playing really strongly on a certain ground. I know St Kilda do really well at Marvel, and our players tend to perform better there, which can give you a bit more security about, whether they're going to play well or not. It sort of raises their floor a little bit as well, which can give you a bit of security in backing them for a vice captain if you know that they're not going to maybe completely flop. You're just relying on the ceiling. The other one that I think I did touch on before is the weather. If it's going to be pouring rain for Brisbane and Geelong on Saturday night, I'm definitely more inclined to take a midfielder like Neil or Dunkley over Dane Zorko, who may not be able to just get that clean chip mark ball that we might expect in a dry game. Obviously the midfielders have got that potential to, rack up the tackles, clearances, in and under disposals, contested possessions, and that's just a SuperCoach goal mine to scoring. We don't even need the game to be necessarily very clean. They just win a lot of the ball, make a lot of tackles that can add up pretty quickly. So probably say those two.
Cool, mate. And just the final one I want to sort of put out here is a team that is in hot form, like an Adelaide. When we consider Jordan Dawes and Isaac Rankin, we've already seen Rankin subbed out of a game early as precautionary. Does that go into your mindset about, especially playing in a later game, does it go into your mindset of you can't really captain a Rankin or Dawson, perhaps due to that precaution? Or are you still comfortable to, for instance, roll the VC on them and rely on one of the Fremantle boys to come up trumps as the captain?
Yeah, look, I don't think it's a worry for me. I think Adelaide were just doing the smart thing, trying to get one of their best players off in a game that was clearly over by the time they did it. I don't think you would see that happening every week. Obviously, I don't think Adelaide are going to get fortunate to win by 80 every week. And if they did, they'd be unstoppable. They do play against North. It might be a blowout. I don't know. It might be a bit more of a competitive matchup against, the team that came out and played really well against Melbourne last weekend. But, these hard games have to start to kick in. I can think ahead already to gather round. They play the Cats. I don't think they'll be able to have the luxury of subbing off a Rankin or a Dawson then. Maybe against lesser teams, yes, it is a little bit of a worry. But we could also see players pile on a big score. I remember from memory, I think it was Zorko put up 70 or 80 in the first quarter against the Eagles at the Gabba last season. If he's getting subbed out at three-quarter time, he might still have 150 on the board. So I don't think it's something that really concerns me all that much.
Okay. Well, before we crack into sort of our rankings, I'm just going to mention 3 players that haven't cracked into our rankings, unfortunately, that I think are really good options if you own them. The first one being Christian Petrarca. Yes, the form isn't there, 78 and 98. But in his last 3 games against Gold Coast, he has scored 122, 129, and 148. Just like Max Gawn, one of the spiritual leaders, or one of the leaders of Melbourne, I can't see a world where he doesn't bounce back this week. And given that Gold Coast to end last year was an easy matchup for inside midfielders, I think that Christian Petrarca has the scope to go close to 120 or above this week. In that same game, I think that Noah Anderson playing Melbourne, he scored 130 odd in their first game this year for Gold Coast. But the average against Melbourne is what sort of pops out to me. 122, 169, and 189 and 106 in his last 3 games. Yes, it is boosted by that 189, but that gives him an average of 139 in his last 3 matchups. And he performs quite well at the MCG, which is contrary to his sort of home track, flat track bully sort of the misconception that we sort of have there. 122 average there. And then the man we sort of alluded to before, Jordan Dawson, playing North Melbourne. Yes, North Melbourne is a much better midfield than they have been in previous years. But Dawson is in good form. Adelaide is in good form. And he performs well against North, 121 average in his last 3 games. And he performs well at Adelaide Oval, 103, 143, and 105 in his last 3 games there as well. So whilst they haven't cracked into our top 3, I think all 3 of them are fine options. Let's now move on into our top 3 VC options between us. Rossco, do you want to kick us off?
Yep. I will get us started with my newfound love in life, Jack McRae. I went to the Marvel Stadium to watch him play against Geelong, and he was brilliant. Now, the one thing that you might look at here when you see McRae's numbers is only a 92 average against Richmond in the last 3 games. Obviously, those games were all with the Bulldogs, and he did actually have a substantial time on ground in all 3 of these games. But I know that last year against Richmond, his heat map was a bit all over the shop. He didn't have that inside midfield role. And the other 2 games, 103 is still serviceable. And at 87, he did get some midfield time, but it just wasn't his best performance. I think in the form that he's in at the new club, and obviously coming off a 127 and a 162, he's the one that I'm going to want to be slapping my VC on come Saturday. And I know that it does say Richmond are the 8th easiest matchup for inside midfielders, but that data does include, I believe it's 3 rounds of last year now. They didn't play in round 0. Oh, no. Did Richmond play round 0? I can't remember.
No, they didn't.
No, they didn't play round 0. So it's got 3 rounds of last year's data in it. Obviously, they were a bit of a better side than they are now. So I think they'd probably be closer to a 2nd or 3rd. You saw what Rosie did to them last week. My second option is actually Connor Rosie as well. He scored a 130. I don't actually own him, but he has dropped some massive scores against the Tigers. So he's one that I might be working out how to fit in somewhere along the lines. And finally, I'm going to go with Bailey Dale against Carlton. A pretty decent matchup for designated kickers. Obviously, he's been in flying form, 100 points second half last weekend against the Pies. And, if you get something close to that in a half against Carlton, I think a VC score from him would be pretty hard to turn down. So those are my 3, Janath. I'll hand it over to you.
And with the way that the Blues, that we bombed the ball into opposition defensive 50s, I wouldn't be surprised if Bailey Dale is out the back taking a couple of seagull chip marks out there as well, which builds on the 5 marks that he has total for the year so far. So hopefully I can go to the game. I'm going with my fiance as well, so we can hopefully see a little bit of Bailey Dale chip because the ball is living down in Carlton's forward 50. Let's do that. All right, my top 3 VC options this week. I'm going with Connor Rosie for all the facts that you mentioned just before, Rossco. I think he feels like a must-have as a player, but I think this week in particular, he has the scope. There's no one really I can think in the Essendon midfield that can stop him. And given how porous we've seen the Essendon defense be, it wouldn't surprise me if Rosie goes forward and kicks a couple of goals himself. And that makes him the number 1 VC option for me this week. Max Gawn, as I mentioned before, that intangible factor of the captain that's now this is saying if he plays, which is something that we just don't really know yet. But there's nothing to suggest that he won't play. I think as a proud man himself, there's no real way that I can see him sort of just let all the media attention get to his head. I think that we're in for a really big Max Gawn game. Now, it's weird with Max because in the games that you predict him to go well, he does go well. And I feel like this is one of those games. and the average at venue, 129, 122, 177 in his last 3 games. This could be a big one for Maxi. And then Tom De Koning, he's been a VC option for me in the first 3 weeks, and it really does boil down to just how good of a player he is when the ball gets to ground. He's like an extra midfielder for Carlton, but he has the bonus of those hitouts to advantage. And with Tim English being one of the, on the lower end, let's say, of ruckmen that get hitouts, I think that Tom De Koning can both get him at the source as well as in the spread, spreading from contest as well. De Koning was one of the major players that we were missing when we played the Bulldogs. He might have played actually against English. I stand corrected there, to score the 95. Sorry, but we've seen enough to suggest that De Koning can put bulk points on. And if, for instance, last week, if he was given the goal to start the game, the first goal of the game last week, we might have seen him enter into VC scoring territory there, but he just wasn't meant to be for the Blues as well as for De Koning there. But I think he should bounce back to a 120 plus this week. You'll see that my top VC option is Connor Rozee, and Jack McRae's missing from the top 3 VC options because I've got him as the number 1 captaincy option for this week. So, Ross, I'll pass it over to you to talk about your C options, and then I'll break down my top 3, mate.
Yeah, look, I think first and second is going to honestly come down to a matter of how the weather is looking in Brisbane for Saturday night, because I like Zorko, and Geelong conceded massive, massive points to my boys Wanganeen, Miller and Sinclair last weekend, which, bodes really well for a player that's averaging 137.5 to start the season. 136 and 139, and Geelong have just given away, I think it was 140 to Jack Sinclair last weekend. Like, it just seems like a no-brainer to take him. He goes really well at the Gabba, went really well there last weekend, and has a nice 130 against the Cats in his recent history. Now, his 74 and 52, I would suspect, would be before he sort of got that move back to that designated kicker role. He might have been playing forward, not really SuperCoach relevant, and, at the start of last year has gone back and really, really turned it on for us. So if things are looking a little bit dry, I think I'll go with Zorko. But if it's evident that it's going to be pouring, I'm going to back Lachie Neale again to go huge. Goes really, really well at the Gabba as well with a 128.7 average. And I don't know if Geelong would send a tagger to him. I don't think they really have anyone, maybe Mark O'Connor, who would do a job. But watching the game on Saturday last week against the Cats, O'Connor seemed to play a bit more sort of wing, half forward, kind of floating around. He wasn't really paying attention to anyone. They never put any work into Steele. They never put any work into McRae. So I'm not sure if they would really consider putting it into Neale. Although, as you can see by the 41, I don't know why teams don't do it more, because if you can nullify him, you can really dry up his scoring and his effect on games. Finally, I'll go with Caleb Sarong, as you touched on with that matchup against the Eagles. He's had 2 average games. What I did really like seeing, though, was against the Swans last weekend, his huge, huge resurgence in the last quarter to manage to drag himself to a 99. If he comes out with that sort of intent to play the Eagles, who are the easiest matchup for inside midfielders in the comp, I can see him putting up a nice score. But at the moment, unless the weather forecast is looking really, really nasty, mine will be on either Zorko or Neale. So I can see you've got 2 of the 3 as well, Janath. What's your thoughts behind them?
Yes. Before I go into that quickly, sorry, just something I'm pointing out with the table, where it says round 0 and / or round 1 scores, that should say basically last 3 scores there. So that's round 2, round 1, round 0. But yes, Jack McRae, for all the reasons he mentioned before, Ross, I think the resurgence has really started for him. Playing against Richmond, it's a really good matchup. I think he's not really going to be a tag threat because you don't necessarily think of the type of player like Jack McRae to be one to get tagged. And so I'm not really paying too much attention to the average against opponent. And the average at venue, the 162 is basically the one that we're looking at mostly there, because that's the one where he's going to be playing the same role that he is playing now. And we know the kind of player Jack McRae is and when he is in really good form. Caleb Sarong, again, I expect him to bounce back. this is a soft matchup. Should be a bounce back matchup, just like we saw with Lachie Neale against Geelong. And we've seen that he can score quite well against West Coast in the past. And he does feel like the Derby type of play, the hard on sleeve type of play that, yes, he's not the captain of Freo, but you can basically call him the captain of Freo, along with Alex Pearce, Andy Brayshaw as those spiritual leaders there. And then Dane Zorko is the one I've got there. I have a little bit of concern about the Brisbane mids. I think that last year we saw when in the preliminary final that none of their mids really got off the chain. Like Neale scored 107, Dunkley scored 103. McCluggage was the one that scored 123. So perhaps it may just be a dose of divide and conquer rather than rely solely on Neale or Dunkley to be the main beneficiaries of the Geelong midfield being not necessarily the best, but in that sort of sense. Mark O'Connor did go to Andy Brayshaw in round one, and it wasn't the hardest of tags, but he applied enough pressure to impede his run. So he's not the James Jordan style of tagger, but he can still pay attention. It's just the reason why I don't have Neale in that top three. But as he mentioned, with the weather, he could very easily become he could very well become a VC option there. So right now, I think I'm going to go personally for my side. I'll go Tom De Koning into Jack Macrae, or Jack Macrae into Andy Brayshaw, who's not listed here, but just like Sarong, soft matchup, should be one of the beneficiaries of a good Fremantle win to get their first win of the season. Rossco, you mentioned you probably be going Jack Macrae into Dane Zorko or Lachie Neale.
Yeah, look, I think Jack Macrae will definitely be my VC. I've got a couple of loop options, especially if Bo Allen doesn't get up. He's one that's there. Also got Matt Roberts on the bye, so I don't need to worry about team selection really. But any of these three players in my captaincy choices, I own them all. So I think I prefer to still go in the order that I've listed, but I am fortunate enough to sort of get that choice as well, which I'm pretty happy about.
Good luxury to have there, Ross.
Yeah.
And you, Dia, I know you've been sitting here 20 minutes listening to us by ears off, but give us your top VC and your top C option for this week from what we've listed. Or otherwise.
Best seat in the house. Best seat in the house that I have here. Don't get that wrong. Look, I'm that confident. I'm thinking of VCing Liam O'Connell into Jack Macrae. I think he's going to go that well. So I'll tell you, I'm tempted to do that. But what I've always tried to do, and you guys know this better than anyone, is I always want to try to VC the bloke who I think has the best opportunity to score big, and I think that's Jack Macrae this week. So I'm keen to VC Jack Macrae. And who to go into, I don't mind Zorko. Again, as Rossco mentioned, if it's dry, I love the matchup data there. But I'm also with you, Janath. I own Andy Brayshaw, and I can see a decent match coming from Andy. So
it's the real luxury there, isn't it, mate? Having a fallback captaincy option after the person that you believe is going to be the best scorer of the round, which I've got Jack Macrae as my number one captaincy option. Tom De Koning as a number one BC option, but this doesn't make someone else any worse of a captaincy option just below a Dane Zorko, Sarong if you don't know them. So in that sense, you could have two captaincy options. One you treat as your VC and one you treat as your C.
Yeah, love it. And I've got a question just to ask you two blokes before we finish this captaincy video. Rossco, I'll start with you. This week, and it may change from week to week, but what's your VC threshold? So what's your VC got to score this week for you to say, yep, I'm taking it. I'm confident.
Look, I always usually look at, I'd probably say 125 plus. Usually you're under it or you're over it, obviously. But, if a player's over 125, usually it's not something you want to turn down as your VC. You don't really lose that much, say, if you were to take it and then your potential captain goes 130 to 140. You're only losing out on, I think it's like 20 or 30 points or something like that in the long run. And it's just not worth the risk. There's lots of things that can go wrong. So for me, I think 125 plus is usually what I'd go for.
Very fair, mate. Very fair. Janath, how about yourself, brother?
Yeah, agreed. And in best 18, you're sort of tempted to take on a little bit of risk because you want that sort of separation at the top end. But I think in general play, anything above 120 you normally take, even if it's what you you're toying over 5 points between a 120 and a 125. But the last K, when you've got 120 in your hand, you don't want to risk it for possibly an 80 or an early injury. And so it always comes down to our favorite phrase, which I won't say, but you can if you want. You know what it is.
Has it got something to do with the bird in the bush? I'm not too sure.
A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. You don't chase
Absolutely.
the unknown, basically. But look, I think this sort of brings it together. Ross and I, we both agree, and yourself, DR, as well. Jack Macrae is who we project to be the highest scorer off the round. The form is there. He's got the right role. We also think that Dane Zorko, Lachie Neale, Caleb Sarong are really good captaincy options. And from a VC standpoint, we both think that if I go back, that Connor Rozee is probably the best VC option if you own him. But then the likes of Bailey Dale, Max Gawn, Tom DeConning, as well as some others that we haven't listed here, like Christian Petrarca, Jordan Dawson, as well as Noah Anderson, are other good captaincy options as well. So that wraps up the Captain's Corner video for round 3, 2025. Thank you so much for the lovely comments you left on our first pilot episode last week. And we hope that you guys have a ripping round, take our captaincy advice, and we'll see you guys next week for the round 4 episode.
Love your work, legends.
Cheers, guys.